reason.
He didn't have the mic.
And I'll say another thing, that if a disabled vet has a job and isn't doing that job, then he shouldn't have that job. Now, I'm not saying that was the case here. I don't know these personnel considerations, but just as we want to give a disabled vet preference, when all other things are equal, they should get the job. At the same token, if my dad didn't do his job at Augustana, he should have been fired.
With that, I have a three-part question for you. First, the state of South Dakota has veterans preference laws. We would like to know if you can tell us how many veterans, including disabled veterans, are employed by all branches of the state government in South Dakota.
Let me answer that first. I wish I could tell you. We've asked the state government to provide us with that information. They refuse to do so. They refuse to do so. So much for transparency in government. What's so hard about that? What's so hard about figuring out who is a veteran and who is employed by the state of South Dakota? Maybe it's because they don't want you to know.
Second, do you support veterans' preferences? Do you really understand how the states of South Dakota's preference laws work?
I do understand how they work, and I understand how the federal preference laws work. Let me just take a moment to talk about that. Unfortunately, there's a difference between knowing how a law works and finding out whether the government responsible for actually making the law work does that. And in the state of South Dakota, we do not have a very aggressive attempt by the state of South Dakota to make sure that veterans' preference is enforced. Here's how it works federally. Federally, when you apply for a position, there is always a place to indicate if you've been a veteran. If you're a veteran, you add 5 points to the scale. If you are a veteran having seen active duty or disabled, I think you add 10 points to the scale. On the state level, we don't have a specific point system, but we have instead a sort of objective preference system. So that if you are a veteran, you get a preference, whatever that means, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, I don't know of a situation in which the veterans' preference has been enforced in South Dakota. I've actually read the statutes that deal with the veterans' preference, and I can tell you about them. In fact, I have them in front of me. But I think they're worded in a way that is so vague that the administration can actually avoid the actual application of those laws and not be held accountable for it. The net effect is that most veterans who could add value to these jobs in the state of South Dakota are denied them, or are made to feel that they'll be denied them because there isn't an advocate for them to talk about veterans' preference. That has to change. That has to change. This is all part of a process of deciding whether or not we're going to respect the sacrifice you've made, or whether we're just going to make symbolic use of your sacrifice. That's the difference.
Okay. And third and lastly, if you were elected as our next governor, how would you improve hiring of veterans, including disabled veterans in state government?
Well, Ken, the first thing you do is you keep track. Which they don't do. You keep track. So you'd have some way to measure how are we doing now, how are we going to be doing the next year, the next year, the next year. You keep track. I think the federal government has a goal, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's like 15 to 20%. The federal government has a goal for veterans' preference to actually be used. I would be surprised if we're even near 5% in South Dakota. Gene, do you know?
On a federal level, we're, like for the instance, the VA here in Sioux Falls, they're 31%. And the new, under the Obama administration, they want to get to around 34. He's even initiated a hiring veterans campaign that they're kicking off in November. So we're looking, and again, back to the state, my sources say it's 5% or less.
Really?
So maybe that's why the state of South Dakota, this governor doesn't want us to know, because they probably should be embarrassed and ashamed if they did 5%.
Let's think about that for a second. Who loses? Who loses when we decide to honor a veteran's preference? Do we really think the veterans are incapable of doing the work? Is that what we're saying? Are we saying that? I mean, if we aren't saying that, then who loses? If you really believe that veterans are as capable as a non-veteran person in doing a job that you're otherwise qualified for, what am I missing here? Why don't we at least keep track, why don't we at least keep score, so we know whether we're actually honoring the people who put it on the line for all of us? I don't understand what the downside to that is. I mean, I just really don't understand it. No one can explain it to me unless it's a hardship on state government to keep score. Now, it just makes no sense to me at all. So anyway, I think a lot of these issues are issues that change overnight when someone assumes office and says, enough of that. We aren't doing that anymore. That's just nuts. That's not the South Dakota way. We aren't going to do it anymore, whether it's regard to honorable discharges, or whether it's in regard to a separate department, or whether it's in regard to veterans' preferences. That's all done now. We're through fighting those battles. It is embarrassing to me that you guys have to spend your time introducing bills in the legislature when all the governor has to do is say, no, that's silly. We don't need to do that anymore.
Lieutenant Governor, last year's Senate Bill 76 was introduced in the South Dakota legislature. This bill dealt with the members of the American Legion, veterans of foreign wars, and disabled American veterans being appointed by the governor as members of the South Dakota Veterans Commission. The names of the nominees would be submitted by the veteran service organizations to the governor, with the governor appointing the nominee of his choice. The bill passed the Senate State Affairs Committee by a vote of 9-0. The bill also passed overwhelmingly on the Senate floor by a vote of 33-1. However, after a 21-day lapse in time after the Senate passed the bill, it was heard in the House State Affairs Committee. The committee was made up of 9 Republicans and 4 Democrats. The major veteran service organizations were represented and testified in favor of this bill. However, the committee killed the bill by a vote of 8-5. My question to you is, if you are elected as our next governor, would you support revising the composition of the South Dakota Veterans Commission, such as Senate Bill 76?
Well, thank you for the question. I remember that bill. I do remember it going through the Senate. It's my understanding at the last Veterans Council meeting in Hot Springs a couple of weeks ago, there was a decision to try and create a little committee that would be made up in part of the commission, in part of the council, a couple of folks from Military and Veterans Affairs, and they were going to get together and take another look at that very issue, and then try and come up with legislation that could be reintroduced in the next session for that sort of thing. And so I'm open to the idea. I was listening to the number of members, 5,500 DAV members, 23,000 American Legion, 12,000 VFW 250. That's around 40,000 of our 73,000 vets. And there's probably some dual membership, but I imagine you're still representing over half of the vets in this state. And so I don't think it's out of line for your organization to suggest we'd like to have input into the process. I would like to wait to hear what your committee comes up with when the meeting takes place and when there's dialogue among the groups. I'd like to wait to see what is offered in terms of the ideas that you all have. And but I'm open to the idea, and I would not. I wouldn't foresee that being a problem. If you can all agree on something that would work, I'd be open to it.
Just so that the group here knows the full history behind this proposal. The quick answer is yes, and I was a co-sponsor of the bill. Nancy Turbeck Berry is a state senator from Watertown. She had watched the activities of the Veterans Commission with some concern. Primarily the same concerns voiced that you hear, that we needed to change things, that we needed to expand it, that we needed to make sure that the veterans organizations had some guaranteed representation on the Veterans Commission. And as Nancy often does, she just wandered into a dispute, not really knowing the implications of it, or that she would make the administration so upset at the idea that we would change the way we choose the Veterans Commission. But she did it anyway, and she got me to be her co-sponsor, and so we went to battle on this.